From AATH, the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor, this is Laughbox, the podcast for laughter and humor professionals. Here's your host, Chip Lutz.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Laughbox, the official podcast of the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor. I am Chip Lutz, your host, and today only, I get to do some more live interviews here at the AATH conference. And what's cool is I get to talk to one of the coolest man of the cloth I know, Father Paul Moore. He is the dude, man, because he likes things I like him. You know, just kind of funny, a little bit bawdy, and he does some really important work. So welcome, my friend, to Laughbox.
And thanks, Chip, for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, the pleasure's all mine. Now, we spent a lot of time together, hanging out, sharing stories, but for other people out there, can you let them know a little bit about who Paul Moore, the man, the legend, is?
Well, I'm actually a licensed counselor and marriage and family therapist in Arkansas, and I'm also licensed in Kansas and Texas as well. And I've been practicing now for about 8 years. Worked several years with adolescents and youth with a lot of problematic behaviors and troubled youth with different psychiatric disorders, a lot of residential and day treatment programs, and some outpatient. Now I just do primarily outpatient with adults and couples.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we get in the gist of our conversation, we'll just get our conversational juices flowing a little bit. So, funniest movie you've ever watched?
Big Lebowski.
Yeah, oh my God. I didn't know you were a Lebowski fan, man.
The dude abides.
The dude abides,
yes.
Absolutely.
You know, there's a church of dudism.
Is there?
There's a church of dudism, and there's a philosophy of dudism. You can get ordained in the church of dudism.
I didn't. That is awesome.
It is.
And I love how fast you said that. You didn't even have to think about it.
No, I actually try to watch that movie once a month.
Just to, keep yourself abreast of, things.
I also found out they had Lebowski festivals across the country.
No way.
Where people come dressed up as the dude, Walter, Donnie, Maud.
Really? Oh yes. My God. Her character was crazy in that.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. This aggression will not stand.
What I appreciate about the movie is, of course, the Coen brothers are brilliant filmmakers and writers, but I liked how different the three primary characters were, but how loyal as friends they were to one another.
Yeah, all really different, all really loyal.
Yes.
And even when they took Donnie out
yeah.
and were taking his ashes out.
That's right.
Spill them out and then blow back all
yes.
over the dude.
Travesty.
The travesty.
That's what the dude said to Walter. This is a travesty.
Yeah. What was the kid's name that they thought stole the money out of the trunk? I'm trying to remember his name because I just remember when they went to his house.
And his father was in the iron lung.
Yeah, that was awesome. Good stuff. So for our listeners out there, if you've never seen the Big Lebowski, you absolutely have to watch it. Yes. You can't just watch it. It's one of those movies you can't watch just once because there's a lot of little nuances in there you miss the first time.
Yes.
You really got to take them in, enjoy them.
And if you're sensitive to swear words, you need to brace yourself because they frequently swear in the film. But it's part of the brilliant absurdity.
Right. I like that, the brilliant absurdity. So, put your filters on or pause it through there. Put your muffs on.
Yes.
Your muffs. So you went on a trip last year, and I heard a little bit about what you were doing. Can you tell us a little about the work that you were doing and where you went and how things went?
Well, I went on a trip. I should say what got me started on this was I do some work with workers' justice and some advocacy for immigrants and undocumented, mostly DACA, who, children from other countries who were brought here, primarily from Mexico or Central America, who were brought here as infants and children, had been basically raised here, and there were financial circumstances, partly due to some of the issues between the trade agreements between both countries that caused a lot of chaos in the United States for United States workers and Mexican workers and Central American workers. And so you saw a lot of families basically fleeing from Mexico and Central America, also due to instability in a lot of the countries and violence and for their own safety. So I've done a lot of advocacy for that. I've been involved in some things like that in my area as a therapist and a clergy. And I learned about this program that takes place once a year in El Salvador. And it's a liberation psychology immersion exchange program where you basically spend about 7 or 8 days in El Salvador. And liberation psychology is a form of psychology that was basically developed by a Jesuit priest and social psychologist, Father Martin Barrow, and he was skeptical of the impact that Western mental health models had in perpetuating and stigmatizing basically oppression and lack of access to resources in his own country, or in El Salvador, I should say. So there was a lot of poverty, a lot of illiteracy in the 70s and in the 80s, and a number of the clergy down in El Salvador came out and were speaking out against it. And 5 or 6 Jesuit priests were actually executed by the Salvadoran military in the early 80s.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Father Barrow being one of them. And Archbishop Romero was assassinated by a death squad.
Just for sticking up. I mean, just
Yes.
for standing up for
Yes.
The mental health of the
Well,
people there.
for the people's rights to earn more than 50 cents a day
Right.
for farm work,
Uh-huh.
basically with land only owned by a handful of families. And of course there were a lot of financial influence within the military and in the media. So one of the Jesuit priests developed an approach called liberation psychology, which just looks at the lens from the perspective of those who are oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in just layman's terms, really simple, if someone is depressed or anxious and they don't have access to food, they don't have access to water, they don't have access to a living wage, and they're in dire poverty or disease or illness, a Western model of mental health would look and might say that, they would label depression and anxiety as a disease. Whereas liberation psychology says, wait a minute, if you label the symptoms of all of those stressors and all of those oppressive factors as a disease, then you're failing to address those systemic and contextual oppressive factors that are perpetuating that.
Mm-hmm.
And so he developed a form of psychology that stemmed from the perspective of the sufferer and the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has applications, of course, in the work that many people do in this country when looking at poverty or looking at the struggles that a lot of marginalized populations have, or poor people in different parts of the country who don't have access to resources. I mean, you can look at even places like Detroit, the Appalachians, and other parts of the country here, where you see people who have a hard time getting clean drinking water, have a hard time getting access to food and health care.
Mm-hmm.
And so liberation psychology would say, wait a minute, there's people who are suffering and having symptoms of all sorts of things, from trauma, depression, anxiety, and you look at it and say, well, wait a minute, what's going on in their world and in their environment that's bringing this about? And let's look at a way of it. And it asks psychology and mental health to kind of come at it from that angle as well, include it in with the regular, assessments you might do.
So I mean, and that's a great thing to bring out, because you went on this trip, you did stuff down there, but this isn't something that's just relegated to that one area. I mean, there are people that are in bad areas all over, even here in the United States, which we don't think about a lot, because
Right.
we don't see it. We might see it on the news a little bit, here and there, but you might hear about the bad drinking water in Flint, but
Right.
we don't hear about the other things people go through, because the media doesn't really put a lot of that out there.
And it was born out of El Salvador and then the Central American experience and the Salvadorian experiences, but it has application in with a lot of populations, and I really appreciated its stress on poverty and economic injustice. And so when looking at workers' justice and people in this country who are victims of wage theft, which a lot of immigrants are vulnerable to undocumented or vulnerable to wage theft. People whose primary language isn't English are vulnerable to wage theft. Also, safety violations in the workplace. In those type of issues, those persons are easily exploited or taken advantage of. So so it was a perfect coming together when I discovered this conference or week-long conference down in El Salvador that's called Liberation Psychology Intercambio, and it's the directors are Leticia Pileski, Jason Platt, and program coordinator is Juan Carlos Garcia Rivera, and the assistant program coordinator is Christian Chacon Gallardo, and
I'm sure he appreciates the way you just murdered his name.
Well, I want to apologize for that. Well, let me tell you, they take you down there, and they take you to various villages and locations where you can meet persons who are survivors of the Civil War from the late 70s or early 80s, and you learn about the history, you learn about the martyrs and the priests, the nuns, social workers who were killed and tortured, and you learn about Archbishop Romero, who Pope Francis just declared is eligible to be a saint. You go to these places and you hear their stories, and you see the physical remnants of those stories, and you hear the testimonies of people.
That's gonna be powerful.
It was really powerful, and it's all in one of the premises of liberation psychology is that you liberate those who are oppressed, but as a therapist or an educator or a researcher, you yourself are liberated in the process by engaging those persons. They actually have a role in bettering you as a practitioner or an educator or a researcher.
So did you do any like one-on-one time with people down there as far as the therapist? I mean, helping them get through different things, or was it just more of an educational thing for you?
It was more of an educational thing for me, where I learned from them just from experiencing people in the communities they lived in. There was an opportunity to give a presentation at the Evangelical University of El Salvador, where I was able to take my interest in liberation psychology and also humor therapy,
right,
and blend those two.
Oh, really?
Yes, and the blending of that involved, when we talk about liberation psychology, is giving voice to those who are oppressed or marginalized, but at the same time, there are people who have a position of privilege and a position of power, who may not be blatantly prejudiced or racist, but they might be ignorant or blind to some of the systemic or structural oppressive factors in the system.
Right.
And humor, I thought, would be a great way to bring to people's awareness, who might not have seen it because of their position of privilege, how the system they've grown up in plays a role in oppressing others, even if they're not aware of it. And the clip I picked was and then talked about, was the clip where Dave Chappelle, it's been years ago, but where Dave Chappelle makes a hysterical talk about how every group of black guys should have at least 2 or 3 white friends, and that's in case they have to talk to the police,
right?
Which is highlighting the often antagonistic relationship that police officers have with African Americans, and that they often usually catch the harsh end of harsh treatment, and whereas white people, middle class and upper middle class, might not even be aware that that type of thing can happen. And so he would make these kind of funny vignettes of how his friend Chip could go up and talk to a police officer while he was speeding or racing down the road in his car while he was drunk, and how the officer would basically just verbally chew him out and let him go. But then, Dave Chappelle would talk his experience with most African Americans in the audience understood that that's not how they experience law enforcement.
Right.
If in even situations where there's not something illegal happening or something like that. So I use that clip as an example of not only humor, because Dave Chappelle told it in such a clever way, where humor can serve as a catharsis for people who are suffering or who are feeling oppression.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if you do it right, it can also serve as a catalyst for bringing that systemic and cultural or systemic and structural prejudice or oppression or racism or discrimination to the awareness of persons who are just blind to it because of their own position of privilege that they
well,
were
their
just,
own upbringing. Sometimes people just don't. They don't really. I get that. It's like I live in my world, and sometimes I don't see things because I live in my world. And just because my name's Chip doesn't mean I get out of a speeding ticket. I'm just throwing that out there.
That was his name, Chip.
I know. All us Chips, we get all thrown in there, lumped together.
Yep.
But like I see things through a certain lens based on where I come from, and it's not I'm sometimes blind to other things until somebody points it out to me.
Yes.
And I think what's cool about what you did there was bring it out in a way where it's a little less threatening to people. Where if you were coming in and saying you guys are all jacked up here and here, it's a much different dynamic than like you using humor, which is a softer touch.
Yes.
Of people with the realization of like, hey, well, maybe this is kind of like this, and it's really not about them so much as about like, oh, it's the system. Humor, maybe brought that out. I mean, were they receptive to that?
I asked the students. It was the undergraduate students. I asked them to just explain to me what they thought the humor was doing, and the students were able to immediately. Of course, they thought it was funny, and they were immediately able to see how Dave Chappelle was recognizing the difficult and very often dangerous relationship that many African Americans have with law enforcement in parts of the country, and then how that's contrasted with the experience of most average middle class, upper class white people, and they recognized immediately the fact that Dave Chappelle was funny with it and he used humor, that it was delivered in such a way that the audience, whites or persons of privilege were able to hear it, laugh, and then think about it. Oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that before. And so, and you saw this years ago, even with Eddie Murphy on Saturday Night Live when he did Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood.
Oh my God.
Right?
I remember that.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't, and even though it was funny, you were getting a picture of that most persons that were minority and living in the inner city, their experience of family life and their experience of day-to-day living did not look like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Right.
And that's not something they could relate to. And
right.
So that was a funny way of pointing out that kind of economic disparity and racial disparity. And so they really appreciated the students really picked up on it quickly. They got it, and they appreciated it.
That's interesting you bring that up, because I don't think it's anything we've ever talked about on the show before, is thinking about how humor can help people realize things in a non-threatening way like that, where it brings out some of the incongruities in their own life of, oh, you know what, that really is, it's funny, but it's not funny in a threatening way. It's just kind of a realization afterwards of, like you said, oh, well, yeah, it's like that. I didn't, I never thought about it like that before. That is really interesting.
Yeah. The most difficult thing to recognize, I think, if you're just average middle class Caucasian, is structural or systemic oppression or racism, and economic as well. I think economic oppression is very difficult for white middle class, upper class people to see systemically. And I think if you ask people who have good hearts and good intentions and say, hey, are you, I mean, there's racists out there and there's people who are prejudiced, but the more difficult one is the people who aren't personally prejudiced, but who kind of go with the flow within a system that kind of allows the structures to perpetuate it, and getting them to kind of step back in the way that Neo did. At the end of the Matrix, where he saw the code for the first time, when he looked up and he saw what was beneath the images, and it was the code. And I think that's where the humor part can help people, because if if someone thought you were calling someone a racist or prejudiced, or that you didn't care about poor people, there'd be a lot of people who say, well, of course I do. And then they say, well, but they're not seeing the systemic or structural problems. And humor can help bring some of that maybe to the surface,
right,
in a way that is cathartic for the sufferer, but also enlightening and liberating for people who are in a position of privilege. Because ultimately, if they're made aware of oppressive structures in society that where people are alienated from food and water and living wages and racism, then everyone's better for it.
That's some deep stuff, man. I had no idea you were so deep.
It's really everyone else is deep. I just happen to stumble across everybody.
I just read their stuff and we bring out there. That's awesome. So it's cool that you went on that trip, because like we were talking before in a personal conversation we were having, is that what I really appreciate about you is your willingness to really get involved and do stuff and take action on things that you feel strongly about, because it's something that people get mad and they talk about stuff, but not everybody does something. So I think it's really cool that you actually get in the mix and do stuff.
Well, I'm in a position where I don't have, aside from maybe some snickers or sneers or some skepticism from some people, I don't have a lot to lose as far as being vocal or trying to participate or make things more aware or give my time or some resources to like in my own things I'm concerned about and where I live, and on workers' justice and on immigrants and undocumented concerns. But I think people who actually live in marginalized communities or in countries, those people who actually go out and do stuff and who try to push that message and try to raise awareness, it's costlier for them, and there's a heavier price to pay if they run up against people who are who feel threatened by that.
Right. So in a way, you're kind of like Superman.
No, and I'm saying in a way I'm kind of.
What I mean is that it's like other people, like they might have something to lose, but Superman, he can't. He's got nothing to lose.
I don't have. Yeah, I'm not. I don't have much to lose, and I'm not in a position. Yeah, I'm not in any danger, or it's just aside from making some people mad. So,
right. Well, like I said, it's cool. I will shift gears just a little bit, because I think we were talking with earlier about some of the work you do as a clinician.
Yes.
I mean, it's and humor. Like some of the stuff you're saying. I mean, it got a dark humor, but it made me laugh. So I mean, what in that world you work? You can explain it better than I do. So explain like the work that you do as a clinician.
I spent. Let me think. I did 4 internships, which is 4 semesters, 2 academic years, and then I spent several years working as a therapist with adolescents and children with sexual behavior problems, which is a pretty difficult population, and many of them have been victims themselves. Mm-hmm. And then I worked, also did some work with some kids who were involved in drugs and gangs, and then in those years you see a lot of really sad stories of people whose lives have been really turned into I mean, you can almost say like hell on earth, and they're kind of caught up in the system, oftentimes court ordered, oftentimes in state custody, foster care, and many of them have been doing things that they're really bad because things have been done to them that were really bad. And so humor has been really effective in when dealing, especially with children and adolescents of any population, humor's been helpful in kind of breaking that barrier. A lot of kids don't want to go to therapy. They don't want to talk. They don't want to listen because they're angry. They're going, and I get it. I wouldn't want to be forced to go see a therapist if I was 12 or 14 years old. So humor has been really helpful in building rapport, building camaraderie with clients, and helping them open up and letting them see you're not this kind of authority teacher figure, but it's more of a collaborative process where you're wanting to help them work through stuff. So it's been helpful from a clinician's perspective, and but it is also as a practitioner, humor's been helpful, and just for my own self-care, and other therapists I know that are here at the conference and that are back where I live. And if we didn't have humor and laughter to to get through some of that, it would be pretty tough.
Right. So let's go back to so when you're trying to connect, with that kid that comes in. I mean, do you just like kid around with them, or you got like a list of like these are the therapy approved jokes? I mean, what's your process? I mean, you just size them up, like, and you say something obscure, or you like show the Dave Chappelle clip. I mean, what do you do?
It depends on the kid. It depends on the problem, the presenting problem. So, if someone came in with trauma, you wouldn't want to start cutting up with jokes. You wouldn't want to start cutting up with laughing if they've been a victim of something where they're really traumatized. That would probably be inappropriate. But some of the oppositional kids, some of the ADHD kids and adolescents who are kind of they might come in and they'll start cussing you, and they don't think they need to talk to you. And what's interesting is some people think sarcasm is not good humor, but some kids who have really been, how would I describe them? Some kids and adolescents and kids who've really been, is it road weary?
Yeah, all right.
By life.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're road weary with life at a young age, and they don't really want to be talked to like they're little kids, and because they're in some ways they've been through more than a lot of adults.
Right.
And so if you talk to them like you're kind of pampering them,
it's just going to piss them off.
It just just piss them off. Makes them angry.
Yeah.
They think, look, I'm not. So if you're a little sarcastic with them, or you have a kind of a joking banter, and you're self-deprecating,
right?
I found that's a lot of times has really opened up kids and adolescents and teenagers to of certain populations and certain presenting issues that. That's opened them up to talking.
Yeah, it's so interesting to say that because and obviously, like, what I'm going to share here is not the same type of population you deal with. Like, but when I teach, Sunday school, high school or middle school students, I know that if I come from authoritative, we're going to get through the stuff here, they don't have anything to do with it. But if I kid around with them and I mess with them a little bit, and we've got a little rapport built that way, they're much more likely to, one, listen, but two, share things they normally wouldn't share, and it's just a different dynamic.
Yeah.
And so like, especially with the boys, I mean, like both of my sons, they responded mostly if I just like treat them like I was, I was still in charge, but I would mess them like when my older brothers messed with me all the time.
Right.
Just like, relentlessly, and then they've got that same kind of like wicked sense. And even with my youngest son, he always had like a bunch of boys that came over that I called the gaggle of dumbasses. And I would always mess with them, and they just like had I was like their I don't say their hero, but we had a good rapport where it's like, hey, Mr. Lutz, or they tried to call me Chip. I'm like, no, you're going to call me Mr. Lutz. And I would kid with them a little bit about it, and they're like, well, Mr. Lutz, what do you think about this? And then so we had that, but it's kind of neat that you kind of speak their humor language in a way.
Yes. Yeah, and a lot of it is not just in building rapport, but also I've been in certain milieus or places I've been kind of a prankster where I work. So I remember working with some.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I wouldn't guess that from some of the stuff I've seen.
So I worked at this one agency where I was working with the kids who were like 14 to 18, court ordered, had come from some gang or drug backgrounds or rough backgrounds, and I mean, really, just tough families. They come out of tough communities, tough environments, and if you joked around with them, let them listen to some music at first, and just let them know you were hearing them and what was interesting to them, and it wasn't just you trying to impart, to educate them on what they need to do. They opened up, and I one of the things I did with a couple of the kids is I took, that magic powder you can sprinkle in a glass when you pour water. Magicians use it, and they pour water in it, and then you turn the cup upside down, and it gelatinizes the water.
Really?
Yeah, it's a magic powder. You can buy it online. I forget the names of it, but magicians do it. They'll look. I'm pouring water in this red plastic cup, and then he'll wave his hand around. When you tip the cup over, nothing comes out. You don't show them what's in there, but the water's gelatinized.
Right.
So I took this one place I worked. The kids had really been behaving really well. I said, okay, we're going to play a prank on some of the other counselors. And so we went and sprinkled that powder in the toilets. And so I brought them with me. I said, hey, this is going to be great. We're going to love this, right? And so I think one of the milieu coordinators was just shaking his head because he knew what we were doing, and just so that when the other counselors when the other counselor go into the bathroom or something, they wouldn't realize it. Of course, the water's gelatinized. Now it dissolves when you flush it. Water dissolves it.
So
but
you would probably make the building guys. Because I was like,
yeah.
God,
no,
dang it, Paul's been in here again.
No, it doesn't plug anything up, but you don't know what's happening.
Right.
You go to the bathroom and everything's just sitting on top of this massive gel. It's the water in the toilet's turned to.
That's good stuff.
Oh, the kids you work with are just laughing hysterically, and you go back to the office and you spend 5-10 minutes doing that with them, and then when you go get them for a session, they'll they look at you like you're a person,
right,
as opposed to a robot or something who's just in there.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
That is so funny. I didn't know there was such a thing as
Google it.
That does that, and I can just imagine some of the people you work with probably have no sense of humor. And so, like, they will go in there and they're like, "What's going on here?" Yeah,
it's usually the HR or clinic directors. It's not they don't have any sense of humor. They're the ones that are most nervous and anxious about anything that happens out of their control.
Right. That's
so
funny.
that raises their stress, their anxiety level a lot. So, but sure, the kids love it. So.
I would love it. That would be so fun.
Yeah, we can talk about that later. Where to order that from? And
yeah, we'll have to get some of that.
Yeah.
Now, shift it back to what you're saying on it as clinicians. Because you guys see some nasty stuff, see the underbelly of society, have to deal with a lot of horrible things. I mean, how did humor help you guys kind of deal with some of that stuff?
When we do staffings, I can't really tell. We would just use humor and laughter to just manage what was sometimes. I mean, we would always process stuff, obviously in clinical staffings wherever you work. Most clinicians do, and they have a clinical supervisor they talk to. But at the same time, there's humor and laughter used to cope with the gravity and severity of what you're dealing with. It's not just clients or patients that are having problems, but especially with adolescents and youth, but even adults, sometimes the problems are so layered and deep, and I don't just mean personally, but like societally, in the community, that it's almost like the healthcare providers of all professions, therapists, doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, it's like they're putting their finger in the holes in the dike, and it still just keeps springing.
Right.
And so sometimes it feels like, okay, are we going to be able to hold this up much longer? And humor and laughter just help you. And sometimes it's kind of sarcastic. It can be kind of dark a little bit, but that's really kind of cathartic because, as one therapist told me when we were in a staffing making a joke about something, she said, if you don't laugh about it, you'll cry.
Right.
And so that's really true. And I think any clinician or healthcare provider that's connected to their work does both. They cry and laugh.
So doing a callback, it almost like it gelatinizes the water behind the dam there, so it doesn't get through.
There you go. I could use that metaphor. I could try that on the.
I was really, if ever get to use the word gelatinize, so I was trying to throw it in there.
I'll tell you another one the clients love. The clients love the fart and barf spray. Yeah, liquid ass and liquid barf.
I didn't know there was.
Oh, there is. Google it. So I hope those guys hear that and appreciate AATH for that. But yeah,
absolutely. For the listeners, I mean, you got great things to Google and pick up. I mean, I think we probably need to get our own online store to sell these things.
I found it on YouTube and I bought some of it and I was letting some of my therapist friends and some teenagers like, man, let's look at this, and it's really funny.
I think I'm going to pick up some of that stuff just to use at home for fun. It was driving my wife absolutely crazy. That'll be good.
Well, it helps bring the family together.
Oh, good. Oh, I've had a good time. I always have a good time talking to you. I mean, you're just a
Likewise.
great guy, and you're doing so much great work out there. If people want to get connected with you outside of here, I mean, are you on LinkedIn, anything for people to connect with you, or?
Well, I practice out of Arkansas, so I don't really.
They don't even have the internet there, do they?
It's just up and running. It's just up and running, but only between the hours of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. So no. I mean, there's a large retailer in the area. They're going to make sure that the internet stays up in Arkansas. So, So I'm, I have a counseling practice, client focused counseling, and clientfocused.org, and that's just my counseling practice. And I also see clients out of another clinic, but they can reach me at that. And I do some work at Northwest Arkansas Workers Justice Center out of Springdale, Arkansas. If you Google that, you'll see that they do a lot of work defending and standing for the rights of low-income persons, their safety, that their wages aren't being stolen. Those are some big problems with vulnerable populations in this country. Employers stealing, not paying them for work that they are due, and safety violations. You can read about that on their website. So,
all right, cool beans. Now, so I always like to end with something a little bit more upbeat and funny. So, you got a favorite joke? Anything you like to do to make people laugh?
I'm trying to think. This isn't what I've done with like kids that just sit there and they don't want to talk in therapy, that are really obstinate or mad that they have to be there. They're just, their court either made them go, their court or their DHS or their JPO or something. And you're really just trying to get them to buy into therapy, and they don't want to talk to you. And you don't want to just be another authoritarian voice that tries to, emotionally coerce them. I'll just have them, I'll just ask them, I'll say, hey, put your hand on your head, scratch your head, and I'll do it with them. I'll scratch my head and they scratch theirs, and I'll just say, repeat after me, my butt itches. And it takes the kids or the teenagers about 2 seconds to realize what they just said.
Right.
And once usually when that happens, they're smiling. So
there you go. Applicable, any population.
Yep.
I don't know if I'll do it with my wife, but I might.
You can trick her.
I can trick her. Well, thank you very much, my friend. I appreciate you spending the time. I know people listening are going to get a lot from our conversation today. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Chip, for having me.
Pleasure is mine.
This is Laughbox, the podcast for laughter and humor professionals. Laughbox is made possible by a grant from the National Speakers Foundation and is brought to you by AATH, the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor. Find out more at aath.org. Be sure to review Laughbox on iTunes. For show notes and more information about today's conversation, visit laughbox.aath.org.